love plants apparently more than he.
Yeah, yep. Yes, yes, I know. Yeah. Yeah, Hal wasn't a huge fan, but he would do it, whereas I'm not likely to do it. So, until the weeds take over and yeah, there he is. I have to do it. I can't. What can I do, right?
Most work for the least fun.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, well, I think we're.
There are those people that find it relaxing, right?
Oh, there are. There are people who just love it. Well, we're going to start. I'll wait for Megan to get comfy. Have your tea. Everybody's got a. Yeah, we absolutely. There's nobody there. Yeah, exactly. Lay back in your chair. Yeah. Okay. Well, the reason I've said a new perspective is because the last time I did this talk, I talked about founding fathers, quote unquote. And that was a while ago, maybe 2021 or 2022. Since then, I've changed my perspective and is founding families, and there will be some wives and children included in this discussion. So hence the new perspective. Don't forget, you can ask questions anywhere along the way, and it's just fine with me. Okay. I try to define a founding family based on what I think of as a founding family. And I'm hoping that that is a definition that sort of resounds in your mind as well. I think that I had to control it a little bit, so I decided to focus on the first decade of the settlement of Gravenhurst, which was, of course, not Gravenhurst, but McCabe's Landing, and then eventually became Gravenhurst. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be covering any of the founding families who founded what we would now call Greater Gravenhurst, which would include Morrison and Muskoka and Ryde and so on. Whoop. Oh, no, I'm just getting started. So I really have directed this to the 1860s, and I really directed it to the founding families of the central town of Gravenhurst. So just so you know, I'm not going to be in Ryde and so on. I think that one of the things I think of when I think of a founding family is the business of establishing a character of a place, the character of a place. Yes. You know, that they give it character, they give it, they establish a sort of a tone for a community. And I think our community has a very different tone from, say, the community up the road. Well, hi there. Good to see you. Anybody else coming there? I'm gonna close. Is it air conditioned if I yeah. Okay. Great. Okay, so I'm gonna just rehash what I said there. That in fact, I'm focusing on the first decade of our development as a town of Gravenhurst, or as a town of McCabe's Landing and then Gravenhurst. And I'm focusing on families, not just men, but rather families who left a lasting sort of imprint on the town. There'll be 9 of them. I was trying to picture what it would be like to survey wildlands, as they called it, above the Severn River. And that is the way they used to refer to it. They called it wildlands or the wilds. And the man who did a lot of the surveying initially was a man named Bridgeland. And he said, after he'd finished the survey, normally a surveyor would be quite positive and pumped up and say, you know, well, here's where you'll be able to settle, you'll be able to farm. No. He said, I'm sorry. But all I can tell you is that this is one vast field of granite rock.
Would it be easier if we sat over there and then you don't need to swing back?
No, I can just sort of back up even. So that was a picture I took, you know, like that's what you're talking about. You're surveying that. And then you're dividing that into lots for farming. So no wonder Bridgeland was a little bit apologetic for the results of his research. A term that you may or may not be familiar with is location tickets. When they decided to open up the district above the Severn River, they appointed an agent for settlement. His name was R.J. Oliver, and he was going to be giving out what were called location tickets. And those location tickets would be being given out in approximately 1859. So before you could do that, before you could actually locate settlers on this field of granite, you had to do several things. You had to at least get it to the point where people could get into this district. Now, having looked at all the trees that you would imagine be covering and rock covering this whole area before they began, you can only imagine how difficult it would be to build a colonization road, which became the Muskoka Road. You'd be, cutting down trees endlessly, but then you have to get rid of all the stumps as well. And that's the really hard part, is the pulling the stumps. Cutting a tree is one thing, but pulling stumps is another. And then you've got to construct the road. So you've either got to, in some cases, build it up and it's going over a swamp, put in a little bridge if there's going to be a river or whatever. And then you've got to put some kind of a surface on it. They didn't really have a way of getting gravel in an easy sort of fashion. So usually you covered a road in either logs or planks. Neither one was very satisfactory. They are extremely, extremely uncomfortable to drive over. And even planks, which seem, when you look at a picture of a plank road that's just been newly done, all the planks are nice and tight together. Give them about 15 minutes and they start to dry out, shrink. And before you know it, you've got almost as much space between the planks as you would have had if you'd been using logs. So not an easy thing to do, to construct a road one plank at a time. You appoint an agent for settlement. He's going to be the guy giving out the location tickets. In this case, his name was R.J. Oliver. And the question was going to be, who was going to be, and I'm not going to say crazy enough, but who was going to be brave enough to take up a location ticket in 1859 in what's being described as a wilderness? Not for the faint of heart. They were pretty much sequentially, and it was right along the road initially. So it was on either side of the Muskoka Road. That's right, exactly. And the other thing is that road, of course, has got to be maintained. So you want to get all your settlers along both sides of because it was going to be part of their job to maintain the section of road that abutted their piece of land. Now, that's not an easy thing to do. So you're going to be asking them to do something that's quite difficult. There's Richard Jose, really probably Joseph Oliver, and he's the location man. So you're going to go to him at the assigned time and place, and he's going to be giving out location tickets. And these will be 100-acre grants, quickly translated into 200-acre grants when they discovered that most of the land wasn't arable in a 100-acre grant. So you gave them a second 100 acres to see if you could manage to get them enough land to grow anything. Now, of course, the growing patches aren't beside each other, right? You've just got little patches here and there. So that's going to be tricky as well, because you're going to be asked to take possession right away and cultivate at least 12 acres of land in 4 years. Now, that means cutting down the trees, pulling all the stumps, and actually finding arable land that you could use to cultivate. You had to build a house, and you had to reside on the lot until the conditions of this agreement were met. After that, and only after that, could the settler actually get legal title to the property. So here he is, he doesn't have legal title to his property, but he's going to clear the thing, and he's going to do all of this work, not knowing whether he's got legal title or not. Any failure to accomplish all of the terms of the agreement, and the land is going to be taken away from you and going to be given to somebody else. So, it's not it's not an easy foregone conclusion that these people have come here and are going to settle happily. Mhm. Mhm. $5, yeah, exactly, yeah. So, I mean, it's still cheap, it's a bargain. But in actual fact, $5 in those days wasn't easily come by. So who were these brave people who took up the first location tickets? Who would we call founding families? Well, certainly the person who took up a location ticket would certainly, his family would be a founding family. People who built their homes, who settled their family, who left some kind of a legacy behind, those are our founding families. And I'm dealing only with the first decade of our history. But you're going to discover how much of a legacy they really left. Many of you will have heard of James and Letitia McCabe, who took up a piece of land just south of Gravenhurst, you might call it, because Gravenhurst at the time was, I mean, we're talking about some very little cluster of shacks. And it wasn't called Gravenhurst, it was McCabe's Landing. And they took up two parcels of land, a parcel of land which today, if you were to look for it, would be roughly where the Anglican Cemetery, St. James Cemetery is on Muskoka Road, and the piece across from it. They had another piece of land actually down on Lake Muskoka, and he put a little wharf in down there, and he put a little scow down there. And so people could actually come and if they were going to stay at McCabe's, which I'll talk about in a second, they could go down to that little wharf down there, borrow the scow, and go for a little run around on Muskoka Bay. James and Letitia took in travelers passing by. Now, they didn't do it for free. Obviously, people would pay them, but people could only pay what they could pay. And so there were times when, in fact, they didn't get much of anything for taking them in and feeding them and so on. And on top of that, they donated the land for the first church and the first cemetery in the settlement, which is St. James Church, which was built right where the cemetery is, and for that cemetery. So they actually donated that land, although they were not Anglican, they were Catholic.
You know where they came from?
Yeah, we do actually. We have a sort of a history of where they came from Ireland initially to Canada, and they had settled down in Lincoln Township, or Lincoln County, I guess, right, and then had moved up from there. So I think he was one of those people who didn't like being where a whole lot of other people were. So he's going to head into wilderness lands, and he's going to go, okay, I want to be where it's, it's wide open spaces and so on. He was one of 5 settlers who we'll meet who built the first school by hand. And I think a legacy he left us is that establishment of a sense of hospitality and generosity in our community. I think that's something that we've benefited from ever since. There's the Anglican Church and the piece of land that they left to the Anglican Church. We believe that is St. James Anglican Church, the first one. It was probably finished in 1867, but in actual fact, that picture is just about when it was being finished. You can see what it looks like when you cut trees.
Yeah.
Look at the stumps as far as the eye can see in the background behind that church. And you've got to pull all of those out, and you're not using equipment to do it. You're doing it the hard way. So we can only imagine how much work, back-breaking work was done there. Thomas McMurray wrote a book in 1871 in which he described coming to Muskoka and so on, what it was like to come. And he described coming to McCabe's home where they took in travelers. And I think that he was very fair when he described it, because as he says, he was hungry and footsore because you're walking all the way from, at least from what we would call Aurelia. He met up with an Irish welcome served up by Mother McCabe. You'll notice that Mr. McCabe was called Mickey. that would be the tendency of the population to look upon all Irishmen as Michael and all Irishmen as Catholic and all Irishmen as therefore mix, and therefore, which is the sort of whatever you want to call it name for Catholics. And I was one, by the way, so I'm not stepping outside the bounds here. And in actual fact, she would just be called Mother. Anyway, as he says, and I think interestingly enough says that what she served up and the place in which they were going to stay, or he was going to stay, would not have disgraced any hotel north of Toronto. So that's pretty nice. There was nothing. There was absolutely nothing. When Thomas McMurray came in 1868, 9, and then wrote about it in 1871, I mean, we're still looking at virtually nothing there. It's just bush. And so, in fact, this would be one of the very few places you could ever, stay. The descriptions were very much that it was very, very clean. McCabe's Landing didn't exist. Muskoka Township as a name did. Sorry, McCabe's Landing existed. Muskoka Township did. Gravenhurst did not exist until 1862, when the post office, as they did, as soon as they established a permanent post office, someone from the post office service named the community. And in this case, it was Dawson LeSueur who named Gravenhurst because he was reading a book called Gravenhurst, or Thoughts on Good and Evil. And so that was the name that just occurred to him. And he thought, oh, I'll call it Gravenhurst. I've heard a few people say they wished it had been left at McCabe's Landing, but I think that Gravenhurst is a nice name too. Anyway, you can see how quickly Muskoka Township grew. The census of 1861 combined for Morrison and Muskoka had 67 families. Just the township 10 years later had 112 families. So I think you're sort of talking about doubling and doubling again. Here he is, my favorite, my favorite settler, my favorite, just about anybody in history in Gravenhurst. That's a man that I have come to really admire. And when I met with his family not too long ago, but a year ago, I was able to tell them a great deal about him. They were absolutely flabbergasted at how much I knew about him. But in actual fact, I did because I admired him so much that I had done a lot of work on finding out about him long before they ever came. Anyway, he was a sailor by trade. That's what he had been in England. And so when he came to Canada, he appears to have had a little pot of money, probably saved up as a sailor. He's not going anywhere to spend it. A true Renaissance man in every way that you can think of. He came here, he came to Canada, he came to Toronto, came to Gravenhurst, sort of in step by step, very quickly. And he borrowed the scow from James McCabe, stayed at their house, borrowed the scow, and he went out in Muskoka Bay and he saw Cliff Bay. And he said, whoa, that's a nice piece of land there. I think that's where I'd really like to settle. So he just turned around, went back to England, brought his fiancée, whom he married in England, brought Fanny back with him, and they built their home in 1861, right on the property where now you could say on the property where the two sanatoriums were, the big Muskoka Sanatorium and the Fire College, that sanatorium there. So that whole point of land, which I'll show you in a second, is what he took as his plot. He was a man who could do just about anything he put his mind to. So when, in fact, A.P. Coburn built the Winona in 1865, the first steamship on the lakes, the first man he found who'd be able to pilot the thing until he actually got people hired to do it was Thomas Robinson. And he piloted it for a while. He guided the first tourists that ever came to Muskoka. They were initially students and eventually professors at University of Toronto. And the first time they came, they were just curious. They were two guys, Campbell and Bain. They wanted to just take a look at this wilderness. And he guided them all over in canoes or the scow. And eventually they started to come every summer, and they took their whole holiday in Muskoka. They would bring their friends. He would guide them first in Lake Muskoka, then Rosso, Joseph. He took them all over the place. And they were very well educated people. He fit in so perfectly that, like all the others, he had his own nickname in this group. And he took part in their plays that they did at night. He took part in their religious services on Sundays. He took part in their readings and so on. He fit in like a glove, and his house became the first tourist home in Muskoka. He was so widely read that it was absolutely amazing. When he died, they discovered that not only was his home filled with books, but his boat was filled with books as well, because he never went out in the water unless he had sort of, 10 books at least with him, if not more. He was another one of the 5 settlers who built the first school by hand. And he wrote a really beautiful account of coming to these wild lands. It's in 9 chapters, basically. And it's beautifully written because, as I say, he was a true Renaissance man. He built a sailboat that he called the Wave, and he entered it in every race that was going here, Bracebridge and so on. Never, ever did he enter a race that he did not win. He was the first court bailiff appointed when they started to hold a few courts in Gravenhurst. He was an actor in local theater right through until almost till he died. And he was a government appointed meteorologist. Wonderful man. There's the Wave. Not just your little average tiny dinky sailboat, quite a nice one. He actually sank it once. He ran into one of the steamships, or one of the steamships ran into him. I'd more likely go that way. And it went turtle, and then he brought it back up again. So it was fine. He regretted selling 2 pieces of land that he did sell to the National Sanatorium Association. Not sure why he regretted it, other than maybe thought if he had left them to his children, there would have been some money for them. But anyway, he sold the piece of land that would be the first TB sanatorium in Canada, and then the second one, the first free TB center in the world, all by the National Sanatorium Association. That's the home he built. Log cabin initially, this one a little later, 1885 roughly, and it was called Robinson House. Later, when it was bought by the Flowers family after he died, they called it the 3 Flowers Inn. That would have been a nice spot to stay. Doesn't that look lovely? I mean, it really does. There's where he had his land. So he's got some pretty nice little points of land out into Muskoka Bay, just before the Narrows there, you can see. The third man and his family I'd like to mention as a founding family, James Sharp. Don't confuse him with John Sharp, his son. This is Daddy, James Sharp, who I'm saying settled later in life at age 40. Now, 40 seems like a child to me right now, but in actual fact, 40 was the end of longevity at this time for men. You were lucky if you got to 40. That was amazing. So in fact, he's probably about 40 in that picture because, he has reached the end of what would normally be the longevity for a man at that time. He too operated a sailboat briefly and took settlers and goods up the lake. But in 1866, he was appointed the wharfinger, which meant he was in charge of all the wharves that would be in the water, on the bay and on the lake and so on. So, he could make things happen if in fact they weren't in good condition and so on. He was also the shipping agent for the navigation company, which involved the steamship and then ships, and was appointed inspector of weights and measures. He also was one of the people who really pushed to have Gravenhurst declared a village, which happened in 1877. So he was, politically motivated, as well as motivated by the need to really establish Gravenhurst as a spot, as a place. I'll show you his land parcel in a minute on a map, but he actually took his 88 80-acre parcel, severed it all into lots, sold them off at reasonable prices, and was one of the 5 settlers who built the original school by hand. So we've got 3 now. Later on, because that school burned down, was rebuilt, burned down, was rebuilt. Then another school was built in the center of town. He was the man who provided the insurance. He believed, and I think maybe because he was a little more, what shall we call it, experienced, he believed that you had to have insurance on a building like a school. And luckily they did, because it kept burning down, and he kept having the money then to rebuild it with the insurance money. Different schools would burn down. Of course, remember, they're using everything is fire related. You're keeping it warm in the winter with a stove. Your lights are going to be fire related as well. So everything that you've got in your school is going to be, a combustible school with fire everywhere. He was appointed all kinds of things, justice of the peace, immigration agent, so on, as well as the other things. And it's his son, John, who built one of the really early hotels in Gravenhurst called the Caledonian Hotel and Store. James actually was kind of more related to the store, John, the Caledonian Hotel. When he died in 1897, I thought that the things that they said about him were kind of neat. A canny Scot, boy, you can't say anything better to a Scotsman than that. It's canny, meaning very intelligent and yeah, knowing a lot and sharp. He's a sharp guy, intelligent, charitable, and social. I think that's a pretty nice epitaph.
Where was the first?
Up where the North School was. Yeah, it was right in the spot where that North School was, which for people who aren't sure where that would have been, it's basically on, what's the name of the street I'm looking for? Winewood Street, which at that time was called Bracebridge Road. Okay, so, but it was built at the corner of Miss Road and Winewood, where that big gray sort of whatever that building is, offices, apartments, and so on there, it was there. And that was called the North Ward School. And that's the one that they built initially by hand several times. No, he was elderly by those standards, in his late 70s. Yeah. There's the land that he owned. That was his parcel. And he divided all of that up into lots and sold them off at $40 a piece. My house is in his parcel of land.
And it has been for a long time, has it? Your property?
My house is about 110, 120 years old, but this goes back, even a little earlier to, the 1870s, 1880s. Well, yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you think to yourself, if you're living in Southern Ontario in relatively good farmland, maybe in a community, few amenities around you, what on earth are you doing coming to what you would call the wilderness? But there were already tourists, that's right. And that was 1860 when Bain and Campbell came up here. I mean, that's just amazing from U of T. People had more of a sense of adventure, I think, than we do now, maybe. Or maybe just the people who came here had it, and therefore we were really aware of them. I think there were people as well who had a sense of wanderlust. So all very well that I've settled a farm down here. Oh gosh, I'd like to see what's up there. I wonder what's in that wilderness spot up there. Got to go and see. Yeah, and that's, I think, really what led a number of these people to do that. I don't know, Joseph Brock must have had a strong sense of wanderlust because he walked from Thamesford to Gravenhurst, to McCabe's Landing, 3 times. He walked the first time to come up and see what existed, what was there in 1860. And he put a little shack sort of where the Baptist church is now. And he just built, like, threw together some wood and said, okay, I'm laying a sort of claim to this piece of land. And then he walked back to Chelmsford to help his father with the harvest. And then he walked back to Gravenhurst or McCabe's Landing the next year with an oxen, pulling a sledge with all his belongings that he could get on there, and leading a cow by the rope. And having to get a cud for the cow every day, get him started with a cud, and then, try to find food for him along the way. And he took up a land grant of 80 acres. An amazingly energetic and brave man.
His face, looking at his eyes, he looks that way, doesn't he?
Isn't he? He's lovely looking, isn't he? Yes, yes. I've not said that to Barry Brock yet, who's his great grandson. But Barry actually looks like him a bit, He really does. You can see if you take the face. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, a wonderful man, this man. And there's the map that kind of gives you an idea. This is a map from, I don't know, about 1870, I think. And it shows you the 303 kilometers that you would be traveling on if you were on the highways that we have today. Now he's walking through bush. So how many miles would he really be, or kilometers would he really be walking? Because 303 kilometers to walk it 3 times. And he'd just be traveling through all kinds of bushland. There'd be colonization roads, but you're not just easily available to a colonization road. And he didn't take advantage of the train and go part way and all that sort of thing. No, he walked the whole thing from Gravenhurst down, from Chelmsford up, and did it 3 times. I don't know. I have no record in which he says, and that only took me, how long would it take you? I have no idea. A good week. More than that, eh? Yeah. And given that you're in that 3rd trip, you're pulling a couple of beasts, with you. You've got an oxen pulling a sledge. Oxen don't go quickly, and they don't go very far before they decide they've had enough for today. And then you're also pulling a cow on a lead. Oh, heaven knows. And going into the bush, every now and then you'd come across a piece of colonization road. Whoa, I've hit pay dirt. And then it would stop. And then you're in bush again. And yeah, we hope you had a good compass. That's all I can say.
Yeah.
Joseph married a lady named Annie Brines and built a log cabin. He built it basically initially on the same side as the Albion Hotel and right where the Albion Hotel is located. But when George Taylor came along and wanted to build a hotel, he got Joseph Brock to move his house down the street. So it stayed on the same side of the road as the Albion Hotel, but went down towards the lake a little bit farther. And that's where his cabin was. In those days, you were farming in Gravenhurst because, you were still in bushland. He subdivided his grant and sold off the lots. He had 11 children. 3 of them were lost in infancy. Another one of the people who put his hand to the plow and saw and helped build the school, but a restless man. So everything is all nice and neat and tidy. He's got everything all just the way he wants it, and he heads for Saskatchewan. He just has that sort of restless spirit. And he died out there in 1907. His son Joseph Jr. stayed in Gravenhurst and managed his land and his lots and all of that sort of business until 1905, when he too went west, and he too died out there. The family of the Brock family sort of, well, I don't know too many details, but they sort of branched out a bit. And when things weren't so good in the West, a branch came back to Ontario, back to Gravenhurst. And that's the branch that, if you know Barry Brock, that's the branch that he comes from. He does. He does. He lives on the side of Gull Lake. And that was, well, I'll show you in a second. That's the house, which is actually planked over log. that kept moving down Brock Street as need be. And there's where Joseph Brock's parcel of land was. And yes, Barry, well, there used to be actually a set of cabins, Moonlight Bay cottages or cabins along Gull Lake, and that was belonged to the Brock family. And then when that house is still there, but that whole piece of land was owned by them. And yeah, Barry lives right on Gull Lake on one of those pieces of land. No, Gull, yeah, there used to be a Gull Street. You can see it running along the water there. That actually used to be a street, believe it or not, running along the edge of the lake. Now, of course, it was all closed up and then, sold off as part of, well, various and sundry. The town kept some of it and so on. But yes, there used to be a Gull Street right along the lake. And you can see it goes up to Church and down to Sharp. We met Sharp a few minutes ago, whose land went from Sharp Street down to David. So a connection to the Brock family is Henry Brines and Jane Donnelly, their daughter, Mary Joseph Brock. Now, this is a case that you won't see too often, I guess. Normally I put Henry Brines and Jane Donnelly Brines. No, I'm putting Jane Donnelly first here because Henry Brines, a farmer, yep, helped to build the first school, but it's Jane Donnelly who's the person you really might want to be interested in because she's the one that's got the interesting story. She was a nurse by calling. I'm not sure what her education was, whether she was a trained nurse, but I have to think she had training for sure because she was the midwife of choice in Gravenhurst over the doctor who lived here, much to his chagrin. In the Globe and Mail, they carried out a little battle. Aha. It wasn't the Globe and Mail, then it was just the Globe. But anyway, in 1874, Dr. Adams sort of opined about midwives and, well, they maybe shouldn't be doing this. And, oh, it should be a doctor. And, really she's eating into the, the sort of income that a doctor should have and blah, 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 blah. And then somebody else writes a piece about midwives generally. And then Jane Brines fires back. Not to be gainsaid, she says, listen, if the people ask me to do it and they can't afford your fees, but you can afford what I might charge, and I don't charge if you can't afford it, period. I just come and deliver the baby. I think maybe you haven't got a case or a leg to stand on. And in fact, that was true. And so the Globe and Mail finished off with the last article, the last of the Gravenhurst case. And I would say that anyone reading the 4 articles would decide that in fact, Jane Brines had won the argument, hands down. People wanted choice. They didn't have money. They didn't have, you should be able to have choice. And in fact, that's what she was offering. Even though her name is not correctly spelled, that is Jane Brines' piece of land. And it's just below the edge of where Gravenhurst had been developed to. So it's just south of the edge of Gravenhurst down there. And even though it's spelled Bryans, in fact, it was Mrs. Brines' piece of land. So when I'm talking about those 5 settlers building a school, that's not it. That's the maybe 4th or 5th iteration of the school. The original one was log. Then it was log again. Then it was log again. And then it was this. And yeah, that's the North Ward School. And actually look at how long it went. Over a century, that school. And the number of people who were very proud of being able to say, I went to the North Ward School. And at one point it was like all 8 grades, then it became 4 grades and some high school, or what they called continuation school. Yeah, so all kinds of people, when you're reading their sort of their little life biography, they mentioned with some pride They went to the Northward School, right on. Yes, yes. Well, yeah, I was just trying to think too of somebody I was reading just the other day. Oh, Barlow. Keith Barlow went to that school and wrote about going to that school actually as well. And the son of Joseph Brock, Joseph Jr., went to that school and wrote quite a lengthy, not terribly well spelled, but quite a lengthy description of the corporal punishment he underwent in that school one day and just how unfair that was. So interesting sort of history of that school, but lots of pride. More people relate it to Brock family, but that's what happened in a settlement. You had people come because they had family there. So a man named William Moody, who wasn't related to them, arrived in 1861 going to farm. Annie Brock took the train and steamship and then got as far as Aurelia and walked from Aurelia to Gravenhurst to visit her brother, Joseph, 1862. And William took one look at Annie and said, I think I'll marry you. And he did in 1863. They moved to St. Mary's for a while and they operated a general store there with Timothy Eaton, who was also in business in St. Mary's in that same general store. So they sort of had a little partnership. But they came back to Gravenhurst in 1879. They kind of moved around a lot. One minute you'd be reading about them being on the east side, then they're on the west side, then they're on the east side. And at the 1887 fire, the Great Fire, of course, burned them out like it did everyone else. But they reopened again south of the Cornell Pharmacy, which was at the corner of Brocken and Muskoka Road. But they had a home located on Muskoka Road, which some people may remember having seen at one time, which was Moody Terrace. When they subdivided their land, they built that home, the one on the top there. And William was appointed all kinds of things. So for a while, he didn't even want to run a store. He closed up the store in 1902, but his wife liked running a store. And so she reopened again in 1906. And then eventually they sold out the home, which they had divided into various apartments in there. They sold it to Harry Martin. He tore it down and then built Martin Manor, which is, of course, on the corner of Church and Muskoka Road in the 1930s. There is a piece of land that the Moody's had as a land grant, which ran from Church up to Winewood. So they really had, we've seen, so we've basically covered from Winewood all the way down to David with people's land tracts all the way down. We'll fill in on the other side in a minute. Yeah. Yes. No, I don't know anything about the Hewitts. I've not been able to find much. Yes, and they may have been lumbering people. I think they were, in fact, in fact, I know they were, but I don't know anything about them. And I don't know whether they actually ever lived on any of the land they owned, or whether, like so many, they speculated and bought pieces of land and thought, well, I'll just hold on to that until I see what develops and so on, which certainly was something that happened. But I think they're totally involved in logging and lumbering. The next family that I think of as being a founding family here is the Dougal Brown family. Dougal came here in 1863. He had lived in South Ontario for a while and moved up here. On the left-hand side, you'll see him with his family. That's Sarah Jane Scott, that he married first, and his son, who is J.D. Brown, and his daughter, Mary. His wife, Sarah, didn't live all that long. And when she died, he was left with children. And so he married, about a year and a half later, he married Louisa. Louisa was the daughter of a very prosperous butcher in town named King, H.R. King. And all four of his daughters made interesting marriages. And one of them was Louisa. Now, Dugald had had consumption or TB early along in his life. He managed to overcome it once, and then 4 years later, he succumbed to it. At quite a young age, he was 46 when he died. But look at what he managed to accomplish. One thing I didn't know until I started this particular round of research was that he began with a bakery. I had no idea that he had done that. Found an advertisement for his bakery with a flour feed and depot for groceries and all that sort of thing. Married, as I said, Sarah Jane Scott, and then decided he would build a hotel. Good idea, since the only one really was McCabe's, which had been turned into a sort of more like a hotel, but still not too prepossessing. So he built the Steamboat and Stage Hotel. There was another one actually down closer to the water, but his son JD will be the guy who's going to go on and really do all kinds of things with Dugald Brown's legacy. They had several children who died, but JD managed to live. Dugald subdivided his land as well into lots and sold them off, and then established Brown's Beverages, which sold sarsaparilla and the usual soda waters and so on, using only pure spring water. And there's some really interesting descriptions of how he managed to get spring water to his plant, which was sort of Hotchkiss Bay Street sort of area. And the water came from way over, past where the high school is, past where James Street is, over sort of where that subdivision is over there. They found an artesian well, and they managed to pipe water from the artesian well over, all the way over, with people taking water off as it went along, of course, all the way along. And they got the water over to Brown's Beverages. They didn't have enough, so they had to find another artesian well, which they did, and then got enough pure spring water to bottle and to be able to sell it that way, as made with pure spring water. He wasn't really fond of the hotel business. He always wanted to be a lumberman. And so he sold the hotel very quickly, I'd say, 10, 11 years after he opened it. And then his wife died. As I mentioned, he married Louisa King, whose father was a butcher, and whose sisters all made interesting marriages. One of them would turn out to be the great grandmother of Frank Miller. He died at the age of 46 of consumption. Amazing. And Louisa lived until 1949. So she lived, 65 years more. And she, along with JD, until he was old enough to do it on his own, the two of them ran Brown's Beverages. And then when JD, who had been away in a private school, when he came back, he took over Brown's Beverages. And
is it the same building that's called?
well, no, because that was eventually put in. They tore down. I'll show you the building where it was. Well, first of all, there's the bakery advertisement, 1864. There's the Steamboat and Stage House, which was where the post office is now. So right there, right main corner. Call and see Dugald. I love the spelling of Dugald. My father would have laughed at that when my father was a Dugald. And Dugald. Anyway, yeah, they had a livery service. If it was moving, he did it. If he could sell it, if he could bottle it, whatever, he did it. Even though that's the Fraser House and Lafreniere proprietor, in actual fact, that's the Steamboat and Stage that was at the post office corner. And he sold it to the man named Fraser, his father and the father and son Fraser, who took it over in 1876. Nice looking hotel.
Yeah.
All wooden. There's Brown's Beverages as it originally looked. So you can see the horse and wagon going in with big cases of heaven knows what, bottles perhaps and whatnot, and because they're coming back. And apparently Louisa and the son are in that buggy over there. It's hard to make them out in that picture, but they are there. Seems to have been some bunting on the front of the house at one point, but it seems to have come down a bit. Anyway, eventually he sold the hotel, built a lumber mill down on the bay, had Brown's Beverages, which he was running, had the livery service, which he was running. So he was a man who really liked to be active and busy, but lived only to 46 years of age. Sorry about the voice, by the way. I've always liked the fact that Peter Coburn was named Bucky. I don't know whether he has, whether he had buck teeth or whether he in fact was using or people used a name that came from the lumber industry to describe him because he was a lumberman. And he is the father of A.P. Coburn. But Peter Coburn is the man I want to focus on here because it was Peter who was one of the first settlers in Gravenhurst and who made a difference in our town. He came here in the mid 1860s, 1865. He became one of the first postmasters in the town, 1868, was named Justice of the Peace. He built a lumber mill himself on Muskoka Bay around 1870 because he wanted to supply the lumber to plank the Muskoka colonization road. So yeah, you got to have yourself a sawmill for that. And there's a picture of the lumber mill that he actually built, which was the first lumber mill on Muskoka Bay. And you can see on the map of lumber mills over here, which had been made by Mr. Porter, that in fact, the Peter Coburn mill was eventually bought out by the Rathbun Company. You've got two surfaces that you can use for a road. You can have the nice, comfortable log road, which would give you quite a bounce as you went along. I can't even imagine why you would choose to ride in the carriage as opposed to walking beside it, because that would be so rough. There's what a plank road looked like. That's the plank road that ran over the Severn Bridge. And it wouldn't be much better than a log road very shortly, because the spaces between those planks just, the plank dried out space, and then you're still doing the same thing as you're doing on a log road. Peter and Mary Coburn, some would say, had the most influence on our community by having the children they had. In actual fact, they had some really interesting children. John Peter, who became a postmaster here for 4 years and did many other things as well. Isaac Coburn, I've only mentioned that he was a lumberman. He did all sorts of things. Was heavily interested in horticulture. And every horticultural magazine that was published for a space of about 20 years had an article in it written by Isaac Coburn about growing something, about how you move this tree to that, and how endless notes on how to do horticulture. Alexander Peter is the one we know the most about, A.P. Coburn, obviously with his steamship and then a whole series of steamships, the Montreal Store, the Navigation Company, the Settlers Association, and then his political career as well. So they certainly, I'd say Mary did an excellent job of raising those boys. Let's not give the credit to Peter. I think Peter was probably busy. But the last one I'd like to mention is John Thompson Harvey. An interesting man. He started out in Aurelia. His father ran stagecoaches. And he started out working for his dad as a teamster, basically looking after, driving a team and a stagecoach. But he moved his business in 1868 to Gravenhurst. And he got the contract to take the Royal Mail north. And that would be a stage that would be running twice a day, sometimes once a day, definitely guaranteed 6 days a week that stage would run. And he would have not only the Royal Mail, but he'd have people who are coming in to settle and all of their belongings. He would have all kinds of stuff for stores, being shipped up from Toronto and coming into stores and so on. So his stages were extremely busy. He had 110 stages and teams. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? Indeed. Although that's a picture by C.W. Jeffries, who did a lot of illustrating of Canadian early life. In actual fact, that's a Royal Mail stage stuck in the mud. A lot of people have commented on the fact that people in those days, if you were riding in the stage and it got stuck, you were expected to get out and either push, dig, lift, whatever it took to get it moving again. So there's a guy, if you can see him on the far side over there, he's digging away over at that wheel. This guy, I don't know what he's going to do with that piece of wood, but anyway, sometimes the teamster who was driving the mail stagecoach would refuse to take people's belongings. So people who would come here to settle and they've got their belongings with them, at least the important things, they were left somewhere for like weeks because he would have only so much he wanted to have on there before it actually bogged the stagecoach down. I love this description. As many as 75 teams were employed by this firm in one winter, and it was not an unusual incident for a farmer when driving south from Bracebridge to Gravenhurst, had to pull over and camp on the side of the road with his horse or oxen for at least a half an hour while the Harvey stages went by, sometimes 35 in number, all loaded with freight. The writer recalls years before the railway reached Bracebridge in 1886, driving in a cold day from Nathaniel Kirby's at Falkenberg to Bracebridge, distance of 4 miles, and meeting 60 teams in that space of 4 miles, all with sleighs loaded with heavy freight and the drivers all singing. I love that image. And just picture all of them as they're heading up north to like Utterson, Huntsville, and so on. I have no idea where Ashdown is, but in fact, it came up more than once. And I tried to find it on several of the old maps I've got. I'm sure I've got a map with it on there, but I didn't find it when I was looking for it. John Thompson Harvey knew when to get out of one thing and into another. He was adaptable. When trains started to run, first to Gravenhurst in 1875, then to Bracebridge 1885-86, he realized that the day of the stagecoach was pretty much done for. So he decided to become a lumberman and instead built several mills on Muskoka Bay. He also got into politics and was elected reeve of the village. We had elections every year in those days. So in fact, he was elected in 85, elected in 86. And when Gravenhurst was declared a town, he became the first mayor of Gravenhurst in 87. And of course, his name is given to the street in Gravenhurst where his home was. Now, I'm wondering if you remember that house or not. It was still there when I came here. And that house is on the corner of Harvey, of course, and Muskoka Road. And yeah, it was a very nice looking house, sort of a colonial style of house, but it was torn down quite a while ago. Bank of Nova Scotia is there now. Yeah, if that, yeah, me too. So when you summarize what happened in that first decade of McCabe's Landing, Gravenhurst, you've got some pretty brave families coming here, not sure what they were going to be able to do, how they were going to make a living, what they were going to face. But you had, I think, generous, hospitable people, bit of an adventurous sort of a strain in them because they're they're really heading off into the bush, and quietly hardworking. They weren't people who were constantly writing treaties on, how wonderful Gravenhurst was and so on. They were too busy working. They were too busy digging and building and cutting down trees to spend a lot of time with pen and ink, as was done up the road from us. So as a result, when you start reading all the books about Muskoka, you will find one page about Gravenhurst and 8 pages about Bracebridge.
How dare they?
Yeah, well, it was a lot more fun to ignore us because we were different, horses of a different color, shall we say. And as a result, it's pretty funny to really go into researching Gravenhurst history and pick up like a stack of books like that. Every one of them has a page or two about Gravenhurst, maybe a page. And then there's Bracebridge, and it's like page, diagrams, drawings, you name it, on and on and on. Not much about Huntsville either, but a lot of Bracebridge, because that's where the publishing was. That's where the authors were. And so, in fact, that's who got all of the attention. And in actual fact, we spent a lot of time working with axes and shovels. We had a newspaper. We had one really early on that only lasted for a few months. I think it was called The Lumberman. And then eventually, we had various iterations of newspapers along the way. The Northern Advocate and so on, though, were published in Bracebridge. So that is part of the reason why. I mean, even if you're just thinking about the practicality of it, if you're a publisher in Bracebridge and a newsman in Bracebridge, you are a long way away from Gravenhurst in the days of traveling by horse, buggy, whatever, And so you're not going to be on top of. As well, I think Bracebridge was built with a look to a certain type of settler and family, and as a result, had the courthouse and the hospital, although we had a hospital that would have been a perfect hospital at the time when the one was built in Bracebridge, but in fact it was ignored. But it's where the courthouse and the seat of government for Muskoka was, in Bracebridge. And we had a different community here, a very different community. We were laborers, we were workers with axes and shovels and so on. We started the lumbering industry and were the center of lumbering for a very long time in Muskoka and in Ontario, really. And the center of lots of other things like the steamships and so on. But in actual fact, that meant we weren't spending a lot of time with pen and ink, writing it all up. We were kind of busy working. Yeah. Imagine coming to that. Yeah. And that's not bad, because maybe you might be able to move some of those. But if you've got that piece of land that I showed you earlier, where the whole thing is just from one end to the other, as far as the eye can see, rock, not even a pocket of soil on it, how brave these families were, foolhardy, some might say, to come to a place like Muskoka, which was always being described as wilderness lands or the wilds of Muskoka and so on. But I think we owe an awful debt of gratitude to those first 9 families that I've singled out there. Not that there weren't other families, but those are the ones who left a lasting sort of legacy from that first decade of the history of Gravenhurst. Questions, anybody?
2 questions.
Mm.
Thomas?
No, not connected. I wondered about that. Yeah, Robinson Haulage, for example, and so on. But no, not connected. Don't really know,